Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. If you're new here, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without the help of greenhouses or heating or humidifiers or grow lights, just me and them inside or outside or not at all. So if that sounds like your bag and your conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday and I am a complete amateur. Just struggling along to figure out what I can grow, and ta-da, today's story is about something that I have not been able to grow, and now I have. Yes, it is. Look at that, 2 flowers. Aren't they gorgeous? Let me move it that way so you can see it better. And it is Chysis bractescens. There you are. What a fabulous flower. And one of those plants that does crop up a lot in orchid channels and orchid videos. Some people love it, some people don't, but I really love this because the flowers are really beautiful, quite large, and I found the perfect spot for it, and that is the whole point of this video. My goodness, just how do you grow this orchid in my kind of conditions? Well, let's try and begin. But firstly, Chysis bractescens, a very Greek name. Now, Chysis it actually means melting in Greek, and it's referring to part of the makeup of the flower, which I won't go into because it bores me slightly and I'm not a botanist. And the bractescens literally means it grows in bracts, which as you can see, it certainly does. So there you are, quite a sort of botanical name for this very, very beautiful orchid. Now, it's a Central American orchid and it grows at a variety of altitudes, but it can get reasonably high, which means it can take cool to warm conditions, which is great. So often those plants do really well for me. But what I've discovered with this is that it doesn't like the cooler end of the spectrum. So many plants that can take cold to warm can certainly take outdoors all year for me under cover, but not Chysis. It didn't thrive and it wasn't looking its best. So it does like cooler winters, I feel, but not cold. So I bought this about 3 years ago, I think, again, in the early days of my orchid growing, and didn't quite know what to do with it, so it's been trial and error. I did try it outside under cover all year. It didn't not love it, but it didn't love it. And then I moved it indoors actually a year and a half ago, and it really thrived. And I'll show you exactly where it's growing now. It's actually growing on the landing, so as you come up the stairs, it's sort of halfway. And as it's quite pendulous, it's quite a great place to have it because you can see the flowers. But that area gets really bright indirect light in winter and bright indirect light, but not quite as bright in summer. But it does get those cooler nighttime temperatures, but they're certainly not cold because obviously we're inside. So I seem to have found the sweet spot with where this does well for me. So if you couldn't grow it outside either, then it's certainly a very easy plant to grow indoors as long as you give it the right kind of light. And mine is living indoors all year. So that's the light, bright indirect light. Now the other thing is you can obviously see, hence the name bractescens, it has these really fat, chunky pseudobulbs. I should remove all these old bits of growth from it. They're really fleshy and sort of hang over the sides. So it does have that sort of draping, drooping habit. It's an epiphyte in the wild, so it's certainly growing up and hanging down. I guess also that's going to allow water to run off and not settle in the bracts, which is probably a health and hygiene issue. And that's what it's loving. So it does in the wild get sort of dappled light, which it clearly loves. Now, it is also one of those plants that grows in sort of wet, moist, subtropical, tropical areas as well. So it does like humidity and it does like all that airborne moisture. Of course, indoors, it's not going to get massively humid conditions for me here in Australia anyway. But it seems to have thrived. What I do try and do is really mist it. And in winter particularly, I do mist the naked bulbs quite a lot. So I do try to make an effort to mist this plant. But you know what? It's done really well without any really specialized misting and humidity, I think. All right, let's talk life cycles. Now, as you can see then, you have these really massive pseudobulbs which grow and mature. And what you can see here is a new growth. And what you can see here is a new growth with the flower buds. So you get your new growth emerging in spring and it flowers, and then that bulb continues to mature. It then becomes deciduous in autumn, fall, and as you can see from the back here, your bulbs lose all their leaves and can get a little bit wrinkled because what it does then need is a dry winter. Now, I often really struggle with withholding love, including vital services such as water during winter, but this is a plant that really needs it. But as I sort of alluded to, what I do in winter is I do mist the bulbs. And obviously a little bit of that misting is going to just moisten the bark that it's planted in. So I don't water it, but I certainly mist it, and I just leave it. So it is bare, it is naked, not particularly attractive, but it's just sitting by the balustrade of the staircase, minding its own business. Then, quite quickly in the piece, so in spring, you'll start to get your little green nibs emerging at the base of some old pseudobulbs, and off we go. It goes gangbusters. And the minute that you start to see those new growths is when you just start ramping up the watering. And a little bit like other orchids that are heavily dormant and that do a lot of growth in one season, it is going to need moisture and fertilizer for that grow period. So what I try to do is give it a healthy liquid feed throughout the growing season, and that can sometimes be a fertilizer or a tonic like a seaweed based or worm juice liquid that's diluted down, or a fertilizer that is geared towards orchids, or a general flowering plant fertilizer as well. I always just dial down the dilution from the recommended dose to about 1/10 of what they're suggesting, because it's never a good thing to overfeed something, although this is a heavy feeder. And I also mix it up because I don't think the plants particularly just enjoy eating the same thing, because I wouldn't. So that's the thing. Giving it a dry winter and giving it a coolish period in winter, but also making sure it has enough bright light. Now last year I got flower spikes and they started to mature, and we had a really unusually cold snap in late spring, and obviously the temperature dropped quite a lot, and although it was in that same place, it just didn't like it. So it had one spike and it just withered and died almost overnight. And we had about it was about 5 to 10 days of quite cold temperatures last year. Now I made a video with Ali, who is a grower that I met online actually, who is also in Melbourne, also growing outdoors a lot of orchids, similar conditions to me, although she has a much brighter, wonderful space. I'll link the video we made together. And she had exactly the same problem with hers last year. So we had this cold snap and her flower brackets just died, unfortunately. And I wonder, Ali, did yours bloom this year? You'll have to leave a comment and say yes or no. Now the growth habit does look a lot like Chysis type of orchids, doesn't it? Obviously they're more upright, but you kind of have these fleshy bulbs. Let me remove some of these sheaths so you can see what those bulbs are looking like. So you have these large fleshy sheaths. It goes completely dormant, drops all its leaves, needs to be dry, and then produces a very leafy growth which can then flower. So I guess not dissimilar in terms of how it's going to look in the cycle it goes through. And I'm really trying my hardest with those Chysis type of orchids this year. We'll see what happens. But this has delighted me. So I've got 3 flowers on this spike, which is really gorgeous. They're quite waxy flowers, and mine has really strong yellow blotches, as you can see, on the end of the petals and the sepals there, and a really beautiful golden throat inside there in the lip of the plant. Absolutely beautiful. Now everyone does talk about the fragrance, and I'm here to tell you mine has absolutely none. That is often the case with me. Sometimes orchids that are famed for their fragrance, the clone that I have just doesn't. Maybe if the temperature's a bit warmer, it might turn up the dial, or maybe, of course, it's night pollinated, in which case the fragrance gets activated at night. So I'll have to sniff it as I'm walking up and down the stairs this evening. But the flowers are really beautiful. They're very open, quite waxy, but a really beautiful sort of banana tinge to them. I'm in love with that. Now the other thing I do with all my orchids is in spring I give it a topical application of a slow release fertilizer. And as this is a plant that is heavily dormant, I certainly make sure I give it slightly more granules than I would anyone else. Also try to put something in the water, whether it's fertilizer or a tonic, at every watering, because it has a lot of growth to do in a very short period of time to go from this sort of fleshy stem to this really quite fat pseudobulb. So it's got a lot of work to do, and it needs to eat. Now then, potting medium. It's an epiphyte, ta-da. So what it's going to want is a free draining medium, and what I've got here is just medium-sized bark. Now, nothing else in it. Although it is something that likes lots of moisture when it's growing, it does need to be free draining. So I haven't got anything that's moisture retaining. What I just do in the growing season is just water it often. It drains through, but the bark remains, relatively moist, and then let it dry out completely. In winter, when it needs to dry out. So that's all it's in really, quite medium bark. There's no sphagnum, nothing else in there. Very easy to pot. Of course, I have it in a terracotta pot because I'm just a terracotta pot kind of guy. But you know what? It can do equally well in baskets or plastic, whatever you wish. Depends on your growing conditions. For me, an aesthetic thing, but also the fact that black plastic is not recyclable. So I do love a bit of terracotta, even though, of course, that's also not recyclable. But there we are. I have watched these buds with such trepidation because last year I was so disappointed, and I've had this orchid for a few years and I was beginning to tire of it because it never seemed as though it was going anywhere. But mine was a seedling, and as we all know, plant lovers, seedlings can take a long time to bloom. I mean, it's like the best of us. Some of us are late bloomers, but this one's taken a few years. But now I think I've perfected what it wants from me. It's going to be fine. Now, I would perhaps move this outside in summer here, under cover and in a shadier spot so it can get all that sort of heat and humidity and wondrousness that goes on outside. But, you know, it seems pretty happy in its nook where it is. So, I don't know. I'm really looking to limit the amount of moving around of orchids I have to do. So I think this one's going to stay inside and be quite happy all year. Well, there we are, plant lovers. A triumph and a success. I'm so thrilled it's bloomed for me. And I think now, you know, once you get it, hopefully the plant will just know that it can flower with you. As long as you don't do anything dramatic to its care conditions, hopefully it will continue to flower for me. And I'm curious, we have this other growth here, whether or not that is going to be a bud as well, or whether that's just going to be a green growth. We'll have to see. But it's absolutely stunning. And a little difficult to display. As you can see, it's very pendulous, so it does need to be elevated. But as I said, kind of by accident, mine's on the staircase and the perfect spot to put it. But plant lovers, if you have loved this, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. My ramblings are very amateur, as you can see. I have some wins and a lot of losses, but this one's finally rewarded me with a bloom. So this is a win, ka-ching. I hope wherever you are in the world, all is well, that your orchids are blooming and being wonderful for you, giving you joy, spreading love as they should, and I look forward very much to seeing you next week.